Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. This is, of course, the virtual YIVO. We're not in the building because of, the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, but we're very happy to still be learning together and celebrating this new book today, Honey on the Page. Beautiful book. And for those that don't know about YIVO, I'll just say a brief word before we get started. YIVO is a really special place for the contemplation of Jewish history and culture. We have a library and archive with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books. And researchers, scholars, journalists come from around the world to use our materials. And a lot of them are digitized. So even though we're physically closed right now, people are still studying YIVO materials and writing amazing scholarship and creating amazing work of all sorts of varieties. And we love to explore that work and explore the culture and the heritage that is that can be found in the pages of our archives using public programs, education initiatives, exhibitions. And so today is a wonderful example of this. We're celebrating Miriam Udel's new book, Honey on the Page. And we're going to use it as an opportunity to talk about Yiddish children's literature more broadly. And so with that, I'm going to just briefly introduce each of our speakers today, and then I'm going to hand it over to Rokhl Kafrissen. So Rokhl Kafrissen is a journalist and playwright in New York City. Her Rokhl's Golden City column has been appearing in Tablet since 2017. And it's the only regular feature in the world dedicated to new Yiddish culture in all of its iterations. Miriam Udel is Associate Professor of German Studies and Jewish Studies at Emory University, where her teaching focuses on Yiddish language, literature, and culture. She's the author of Never Better, The Modern Jewish Picaresque, and Honey on the Page, a treasury of Yiddish children's literature, which we're celebrating today. Naomi Seidman is the Chancellor Jackman Professor of the Arts in the Department of the Study of Religion and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. We recently celebrated the publishing of her book, Sarah Schinnerer and Beis Yakov, A Revolution in the Name of Tradition. And finally, Jennifer Young is the former Director of Education at the YIVO Institute and is YIVO's digital learning curator, founded its online education program. She also has worked at the New York Historical Society, the Tenement Museum, the Lower East Side Jewish Conservancy, and she currently serves as a children's book reviewer for Publishers Weekly, focusing on books about activism and resistance. Thank you all so much for being a part of this discussion, and I will hand it over to Rokhl now.
Thank you, Alex. So I want to start by thanking YIVO and especially Alex for inviting me to moderate this wonderful panel. I'm a big fan of Miriam and her work now for many years, and I've been looking forward to this book for quite a while. And if you read my column, you've probably seen little hints along the way over the past year or so. However, I want to take the moderator's prerogative and start with a personal anecdote. I was never terribly interested in children's literature until I became an aunt a couple years ago. This summer, as the new pandemic reality was setting in, I was looking for books I could read over FaceTime with my 7-year-old niece. I figured we could give the Harry Potter books a try. I had no idea how quickly she would turn into a passionate Potterhead. As much as she loves the magical world of Harry and his friends, one day she said to me out of the blue, "Are there any Jewish kids at Hogwarts?" I had no idea that my niece was already so conscious of her difference and that she was looking for stories with kids who look like her. I assured her there was an Anthony Goldstein who does show up at some point and has a line or two. My niece was not impressed. First, she told me that I had to change all references to Christmas at Hogwarts to Hanukkah. Okay. But the real shock came when she instructed me to tell the author of Harry Potter that Jewish kids should have their own wizarding school at Jewish Hogwarts. Okay, easy enough. I thought for a minute and realized that there already is a Jewish Hogwarts. At the beginning of 2020, our friend Arla Viswanath published his Yiddish translation of the first volume of the Harry Potter series. I can't say my niece immediately asked for Yiddish lessons, but it was the most excited I've ever seen her about Yiddish. I tell you this story both because I think it's adorable, but also because it was a really wonderful illustration of what the educational theorist Emily Stile has called mirrors and windows. And I'm going to read you a part of a quote from her from 1988. Education needs to enable the student to look through window frames in order to see the realities of others and into mirrors in order to see her and his own reality reflected. The delightful truth is that sometimes when we hear another out, glancing through the window of their humanity, we can see our own image reflected in the glass of their window. The window becomes a mirror. The publication of Honey on the Page is the perfect opportunity to not just celebrate the history of Yiddish children's literature, but to examine how it can be both window and mirror. Honey on the Page is more than just a collection of wonderful new translations. These translations themselves tell a story about the rapidly changing lives of Jews in the 19th and 20th century, their many ideologies, and the way children and their experiences were portrayed. It's also a book about audiences, illuminating the question of the original readers for these works, actual and intended. Honey on the Page is also a book about authors, some celebrated, some now obscure. As I've already started to sketch out, the topic of children's literature is so exciting to me because it opens up so many paths into Jewish history and perhaps even the Jewish future. And I want to make one more note before I turn to today's speakers. In her introduction to the book, Miriam notes that she does not cover contemporary Hasidic literature, and we will probably not be touching on that world today, but I don't want its absence from the conversation to be read as a judgment on our part, but more that it deserves its own specialized conversation. So with that prerogative taken, I'm going to turn over most of the conversation to our wonderful panelists. I'm going to start with Miriam, our star for the day. So while I'm really thrilled to have such an eminent panel of women scholars gathered here, having an all-woman panel also implicates a whole package of assumptions about the topic at hand. So we might as well open that can of worms now, right away. Miriam, can you talk a little bit about childhood and children's literature as a gendered subject and how that's reflected in this new project?
Sure, absolutely. One of the goals that I had in constructing the table of contents was to show the diversity of this literature, ideological, geographic, and gender. I wanted gender parity. And I found that I couldn't actually achieve it, that even in this domain of, that was kind of reflexively assumed to be women and children, we still had many more male authors publishing in the 20s and 30s. And then that's a balance that really begins to shift after the war with the work that we see in the 50s. I did seek to amplify women's voices by publishing a longer work by Tzina Rabinovich than by many of her male peers. So those were some of the efforts on my part to strive toward gender parity in the representation. And the irony of that, of my trying to kind of feminize this, is exactly as you point out, Rokhl, that the whole topic is so frequently regarded as kind of marginal to the interests of the academy, to the interests of literary studies. So I've had to get really creative in thinking about this. I'm following Honey on the Page with a critical study of Yiddish children's literature, where I'm trying to really kind of think through the issues of why this corpus matters to us as adults. And one idea that I've hit upon so far is that children's literature offers us an instance of what Michel Foucault calls a heterotopia, an other space which reflects on the reality of the total or the normal space. So some of the examples that he gives are the garden, which is a miniature, a microcosm of the world that tells us something about the way we understand the world to be ordered, or the cemetery, which is a city with hierarchies and the expression of those hierarchies, but it's for the no longer living. So children's literature actually works in a really similar way. It has been pushed to the margin, and it's this kind of a heterotopic space that's radically other, to the extent that childhood and our assumptions about what children know and can comprehend and will care about are radically other. But by looking at the way adults have kind of populated that space with their thoughts, we're able to learn a lot about the totality of adult or just kind of mainstream Jewish experience. So that's one of the ways that I've thought about it. And I I've also been thinking about how having done this work of translation and produced a whole volume of literal translation has made me aware of the idea of translation writ large, so that it's not just going from one language to another, from one time period to another, from one culture to another, but taking the concerns of adults and translating them into child speak. And as my friend Dr. Jessica Kurzane pointed out, so much of what my critical work is doing is now inhabiting and investigating that world and translating that back into the language of academic discourse, of scholarly inquiry. So I think that's broadly speaking what the project is trying to do, to erase some of that sense of radical otherness and discontinuity between the world of women and children and the world of people thinking the highest and best and most important thoughts.
Mm-hmm. And we've recently been having some conversations about what Jewish canons might look like. And frankly, I find the idea of Jewish canon really weird. Like, I want a lahavdil in there between Jewish and canon, because canon originally comes from this idea of a body of church law. That's what the canon was. It was administrative laws for running the church. So it feels a little bit weird, but also, we're having these conversations about a Jewish canon, and the idea of taking children's literature seriously really asks a lot of questions, or opens up what our Jewish canon might look like. Like, how do we fit? Why aren't there any representations of children's literature within our ideas of the Jewish canon already?
Shall I speak to that a little
Yeah, I
bit?
mean, if you'd like to, yeah.
So, I mean, we hope, first of all, I think whenever we do talk about canon, it's pedagogically useful to have a group of texts that a lot of people are reading and thinking about. But ideally, it's not something hermetic or set, it's something very porous and kind of always creeping outward and expanding to encompass new kinds of writers and even new kinds of target audiences. So I think that we're in an age of expanding canon, if the idea of canon is still useful at all, and that works written for children should absolutely enter into that. I will say that one of the anxieties that I had about producing this work had to do with the power in proposing a canon and elevating certain works for notice and discussion at the expense of others, many of which are so very worthy. So we know from the Noah Kotzen Library, which is a fantastic list of synopses that lives on the Yiddish Book Center website, that the Book Center commissioned a couple of decades ago, synopses of Yiddish children's literature. We know that there are almost 1,000 extant books. And we know from Naomi Prower-Kadar's wonderful monograph on the subject that there were several, at least 4 Yiddish periodicals for children that were aligned with different political stripes of the Yiddish left. And so there's a tremendous amount of material out there, and some of it hasn't aged so well, and I'm happy to leave it on the cutting room floor. But in other cases, it was really hard to say, okay, this is making it in, but this other wonderful thing isn't going to fit, or I have enough stories like this or about this theme, and I'm going to have to leave this one out. So I'm really hoping that Honey on the Page shines a light on this literature, and that instead of becoming definitive, it points a way toward more scholarship. Go, say a little mad, go out and learn and find more and find a way to take it seriously.
The marketplace of canons, I think, is the best way forward. I want to throw a question to Naomi now, because Miriam brought up this concept of heterotopia, which I think is really interesting and useful, that in your work on the Beis Yakov movement and Sarah Schneerer, it's, I think, useful to think of that itself as a heterotopia, that Sarah Schneer saw a moment in time, an opportunity. It was very, a confluence of factors that factored into her being able to take advantage and create this movement for herself and for these young women. So can you talk about what she did a little bit and about what kind of texts were produced by her, by the young women teachers she was training, by the students themselves? I know they had many journals. If you could give us some bullet points on that, there was this place where, all the serious men were looking over there. So the women were able to produce this space for themselves. And what were they producing?
Thank you so much for that question, and also for this amazing panel and this book and the concept of heterotopia and all these ideas. So Beis Yakov actually began in some ways as a crisis of literature. The defection of young Orthodox girls was because they were reading novels. And it was very clear to the rabbis, who were forced to deal with the crisis they didn't want to deal with because they didn't want to think about girls. They didn't want to look at girls. It was very clear that whatever the solution was going to be, it was going to have to involve literature. It was going to have to involve the production of a kind of kosher alternative to whatever the girls were falling in love with about the European, the Polish novel, the German novel, the heroes, etc. So that came up very, very early. And the kosher version was, originally they thought, oh, we'll take novels written by German neo-Orthodox men and translate them into Polish or Yiddish for our girls. And they did do that, but they also had these journals that you were talking about, Beis Yakov Journal, and also 2 different journals for kids, in which, so they basically mobilized both men and women to be writing for these journals, to produce, again, a sort of kosher alternative to the literature that especially girls were falling in love with. It was a very gendered phenomenon because they didn't feel comfortable producing the same kind of literature for boys. Boys still had to do the old thing, read Gemara all day. But what were girls supposed to read? Great, let's write kosher stuff for them. And they really wanted women to participate, and they really wanted women to, they wanted to bring women authors in, and the women authors that were out there were brought into Beis Yakov literature. They put Miriam Udel Naomi's poetry to music for girls. So they were really thinking about what?
Let me interrupt you there. How kosher was this new kosher literature?
That was where I was going next. So It's very easy to think about this as just a form of social control, especially, I mean, maybe that's always true of children's literature, that it's a form of social control. On the other hand, especially so of Orthodox literature, which is clearly trying to step in the breach and to provide the proper message. And there is something very didactic and about a lot of this literature, and I have some of it here. Eliezer Schindler's The Yiddish Neshama, which is full of stories for little kids and questions and songs, etc. And the social control is very close to the surface, as it isn't, I think in Honey on the Page, the reason why it's so great is because the social control is much less evident, I think. But I just want to complicate that notion that it's all about social control, if you'll give me another minute.
Sure.
Because it turns out children are not just the objects of adult attention and attempts at control. Adults are also children who have gotten older. And there's my father used to say, I don't know if he made it up or he got it from somewhere, he said, old age, what a crazy thing to happen to a little boy. And children are, right, you see this so much in the work of Maurice Sendak, where his ability to get in the mind of a child, and people talk about where the wild things are as those crazy monsters that say, we love you so, we'll eat you up, we love you so. Those are the old Eastern European aunts and uncles who are like pinching the cheeks, right? This kind of weird violence that adults, even when I was a kid, it was permissible to do to a child. You know, the pinch on the cheek where you could lift the kid up on the cheek. There's all kinds of, so to be able to see that violence from the other perspective, Maurice Sendak's ability is a kind of genius. I would say the same is true even for these Orthodox men, and the men who wrote children's literature. For instance, Eliezer Schindler, I just showed you the title page of his book, which is a children's book. He himself was a farmer, wanted to be a farmer, wanted to be a knip, right? He was part of the Aguda's left wing, the left wing of the Orthodox world. Who was writing these things were the people who had literary aspirations. Children's literature was a permission for them to write literature. So all kinds of things got in there, and all kinds of desires that are, you know, both about the parent and the child, the window and the mirror. I love that. Can I say one more thing just about Miriam's book?
Yeah.
I love the story, The Girl in the Mailbox. And I love that the father accidentally, first of all, there's all this, people talk about lullabies and the kind of, I saw Jerry Tenney had a comment, right? The ways that lullabies channel not only the love, and this is where you're going to find the mother's voice, the mother's love for the child, but also the mother's insane sleep deprivation and rage, and, you know, when the bough breaks, the cradle will fall. What the heck is that about? So the father that accidentally mails his daughter from Argentina to Europe, is that about the child that's in the father? It's the wrong direction. And there are all kinds of ways in which children's literature is, you know, about adult-child relations, but also about the way, what Freud says, that there's this weird amnesia, that adulthood is about the forgetting of childhood. And I wonder if children's literature is about the remembering of childhood. Okay, enough. Don't get me started.
All right, well, you brought up a lot of things that I want to touch on further down the line, but I want to get to Jen and go from one heterotopia from base Yakov in Poland, and I want to move to a very different, although related, heterotopia of the Yiddish-speaking left-wing politics, especially here in the United States. I'd like to talk a little bit about the left-wing Yiddish political world as a source of texts for children. Now, Jen, in your essay, A Language is Like a Garden, you write that an entire body of left-wing children's literature emerged in the United States and that the IWO was an important center of that activity. This, and I'm quoting you here, this literature in Yiddish remains largely unexplored despite its extensive volume. Left-wing Yiddish children's literature comprises dozens of journals, hundreds of books and stories, as well as thousands of plays, musicals, and pageants performed in afternoon schools and summer camps. So I have a two-part question. Can you tell us a little bit about the IWO schools and the kind of texts they set out to produce for kids? You know, what kind of tensions were there between, you know, didactic and the ludic? And also, what role did assimilation and fears about assimilation play in the creation of those texts?
So when you look at the Yiddish communist education movement in the United States, especially the schools that were set up by the Jewish People's Fraternal Order,
which was a branch of the IWO.
Which was the 50,000 people strong Jewish communist fraternal movement in the United States, which had schools in almost every state, afternoon schools. So already you have a vast infrastructure, and that was one of the reasons that I got interested in studying this topic in the first place, is because this was a huge phenomenon of a Yiddish educational movement in the United States that started in the 1920s and lasted well into the post-war era. So there was something substantial going on there, and there's still a lot of questions to unpack. about what that actually meant. But what you do see is a dramatic shift in what this literature looked like from the 20s through the 1930s. So initially, you have a literature that strives very earnestly to be very much a window, in that it's trying to fulfill every possible didactic purpose for baby proletarians, as I call them. They're so cute in their little workers' caps.
Red diaper babies.
And so there is this real strong sense that, particularly in America, you don't want kids to lose their working class identity, particularly if they're going to public schools. So the most important thing is to teach kids about what it means to be working class and what it means to fight for the communist revolution, particularly with regards to the Soviet Union. So teaching about the Soviet Union. So Yiddish communist children's literature in the 1920s has, the magazines and textbooks include, things about, Father Lenin and the 5-year plan. And you can't imagine what kid would be devouring it eagerly. But in my research, I did find that there were, particularly around the production of the newspaper, the Morgen Freiheit in the 1920s, and which was at the time edited by Moshe Olgin. He very much considered himself an educator. So this is the time when all of these activists also saw themselves as teachers and trained many other generations of teachers who got a little bit more involved in pedagogy. And so we have authors like Shlomo Davidman, who was a protege of Moshe Olgin, who did write a series of very popular kids stories. And I interviewed people who read them in the 20s and loved them. And these were all stories that came out of the camp experience, because the stories can't be understood in isolation. They have to be understood as part of this matrix of the afternoon Yiddish educational programs and the Yiddish summer camps. So in this case, in the communist movement, it's Camp Kinderland. And so kids went to Camp Kinderland. They read stories about Camp Kinderland. Their counselors wrote stories about Camp Kinderland. So Shlomo Davidman was a counselor who was writing stories about the kids that he met there and then creating this highly didactic function out of them. So, for example, in one of the stories, a little boy catches a bird and puts it in a cage, and he forgets to cover the cage, and the bird dies of the cold. So the boy finds the bird the next morning. The bird is dead. He starts to cry. The counselor says, there, we young pioneers don't cry, because when we build the perfect Soviet world, we will build warm cages for all the birds. So, right, I mean, that's a very, very specific way of approaching children and of giving them a message that is not exactly warm and fuzzy and doesn't necessarily speak to children's own concerns about mortality or about where they're coming from. It's speaking to adult concerns about building a future utopia. But this really changes after 1935, when the Popular Front introduces more opportunities for a wider engagement with the wider world outside of a strict Soviet educational model. And it also changes very deliberately after 1937, after the Yiddischer Kulturverband conference in Paris, the 1937 Paris conference, where members of the IDW attend, and they come back saying, we have seen the future of modern Yiddish secular culture, and we're now empowered to create our own Yiddish secular culture. We do not have to rely on the Soviet model. We do not have to rely on anyone else's model. We can create it all ourselves. And so that's when you see the textbooks and the educational models changing dramatically in the communist Yiddish movement in the United States. Even the pedagogical journal that had been created earlier in the 1930s changes its name to reflect more American concerns. about focusing on the home, the family, and not just the political movement. And that's when you get stories like Labzik, which I'm sure Miriam wants to talk more about, because
we're going to get to that in a question coming up. But can you pause for a second? What did they see in Paris? What was in the box? What did they see?
They just had a conversation with, they felt empowered to meet with other Yiddish artists and intellectuals who were from all over the world who were building modern Yiddish culture. And they said, we don't have to create our own model. We don't have to base it on a Soviet model. We can be inspired to use all of modern Yiddish culture as a palette to create our own Yiddish cultural project. Mm-hmm. And so part of that meant pulling from American models. So as Miriam will talk about, when you get the Labzik stories, which were commissioned by the IWO and published in the IWO textbooks, you get, as she calls it, leftist lassie, right? So you get there's no dead birds. There's a loving family and a cute dog who have adventures. Those adventures happen to do with strikes and police brutality and the depression.
We're getting there. We're getting to Labzik.
But it's a sea change. It's a fundamental change in how Yiddish communist educators see children. And all of a sudden they say things like literally, this is a quote: "The child is allowed self-expression and development with no rigid discipline." So they go from baby proletarians to self-actualizing. And the child is treated like an equal in our culture, and that we have warmth and intimacy and sympathy, and that is the relationship that we build with the child. And that was how they changed the entire camp system and the whole production of literature and the textbooks, the magazines. This is when the Yiddish children's magazine Jungvarg starts coming out in 1939. It's full of Yiddish cartoons. It's full of just wonderful stories and graphics that really capture children's imagination and really tries to pull them into a world of a Jewish Hogwarts, of a Jewish American left-wing children's sensibility that they can fully inhabit and that their peers inhabit between the schools, the plays, the camps. It's an entire universe for Yiddish-speaking Jewish communist children.
So I still want you to speak a little bit about Shalema Davidman and the tension between all these other goals and also addressing assimilation. But I want to talk about Labzik a little bit, and then hopefully we'll have some time to talk about the anxiety of assimilation as it creeps into this literature. And I think maybe even with Naomi too, you'll have something to say about that. So, but let's get right back to Labzik because everybody loves cute dogs. Honey on the Page features 3 stories from Chaver Paver's beloved series, Labzik, Stories of a Clever Pup. It's set in the Depression, and Labzik is abandoned by his owners who cannot afford to keep him. He's adopted by a family, by Beryl and Molly and their kids, Mulek and Rivkala. Whereas a dog like Lassie might save Timmy when he fell down the well, Labzik saves the life of Beryl when he's assaulted by anti-strike thugs. Of course, Labzik then leads them on the picket line. So I was gonna have you tell us a little bit about Labzik, and how it reflected the shift in ideology or the approach to pedagogy, but you actually already touched on that. So I'm gonna go right to Miriam, and I want you to tell us a little bit about your work on Labzik, and I know that it's kind of turned into a bigger project. So I'd like you to speak to that a little bit.
Yes, so there are 12 Labzik stories, and in 11 of them, Labzik is the hero. And in one of them, Labzik is just a dog. And so he can, because he is just a dog, make the mistake of biting the son, Mulek's best friend, Noach, who, despite the Yiddish pronunciation of his name, is probably Noah, and is a Black boy who goes to public school with Mulek and lives on the same block in Brownsville. And in that one episode, Labzik is not the hero. He has to learn his lesson against Weiser chauvinism, which is what they called racism regularly in Yiddish at the time. But other than that, Labzik is always the standard bearer. And he has this sort of repertoire of antics, which are all mimetically accurate. They're all actually things that a real life dog could do. So he can lick people, and he can jump up on his hind legs, and he can wag his tail, and he can whimper and sort of cry and be pathetic, right? He doesn't talk. He doesn't do anything that a real dog couldn't do. And that's a really important part of communist aesthetics in children's literature, that you need to represent the world as it is and not to make things too fanciful or too fantastical. And so, yes, Labzik is absolutely out front on all of these adventures. I'm translating all of it as a project, a Yiddish translation fellowship project from 2019. Everything is drafted. And I think Labzik really wants to be a graphic novel, is the truth of the matter. So if there's any, illustrator out there who thinks they want to work on this material with me, please be in touch. And I think eventually Labzik wants to be animated, because he does have all of these politically inflected, but more to the point, really relevant to our own day adventures in the broad familial quest for social justice in all of its forms. So yeah, that's a little bit about Labzik.
You guys bring up a really interesting point, which is that, well, this is my point, is that we tend to think of, Soviet realism or socialist realism as, first of all, very grim, and also kitsch, right? That it's not real art, it's not serious because it's so overdetermined. And I think it's really interesting to think about Labzik as an example of this kind of realist style, but done in a way that's very warm and still it holds up. It's not kitsch. It's actually adorable, and you can't help but love Labzik.
Yeah, so I think I actually unlocked some of what that's about in my last pass through revising the translation of some of the Labzik stories that didn't make it into Honey on the Page. Labzik has interiority, and Labzik has insecurity. And the thing that makes him really unhappy is when he A, feels abandoned, or B, feels useless. And so the worker, the good proletarian, wants to feel solidarity and connection, and not social abandonment, not being at the fringes of a society, a capitalist society that doesn't need him or her. And they want to feel useful, right? Like there's a task and to be fulfilled. And so it's not just once or twice, it's in a number of episodes, a number of chapters, when Labzik really expresses this anxiety about, what if they don't need him? At one point, in order to help make ends meet, the family takes in a boarder who's also a worker. And he needs to get up really early to get to the factory each morning, and he has trouble waking up. And so Molly, the mom, says that she'll take on the responsibility of waking this worker. And Labzik sees that he can ease the burden. If he gets up, Molly can stay in her warm bed a few more minutes. And so he does it, like say the first day is Sunday. So he does it the second day on Monday, and on Tuesday, and on Wednesday, and on Thursday, and on Friday. And everyone is pleased as punch, and they say thank you. And he does the same thing on Saturday, and they start throwing shoes at him. And he doesn't understand why all of a sudden he's a villain. And so they try explaining to him about the weekend, right? But Labzik ends the chapter by saying, these humans, they're all meshuggah, they're all inscrutable. Maybe I'll just run away to Philadelphia, which is like his Australia, it's like the other end of the world. Maybe I'll just go over there where, if nobody needs me and nobody's going to treat me with dignity here, maybe I'll escape. So I think part of what's going on is that not only is the family really warm, really functional, a kind of perfectly well-oiled democratic state where everybody gets a vote and everybody has a voice, but also Labzik holds all of this pathos about wanting to be needed.
And you
Can I
know,
jump in?
what?
Can I jump in for 1 sec?
Yeah.
What that struck me when you said that, Miriam, is that that's also mimetic for what the child would experience,
That's what
right?
I was just going to say.
Okay, so like on the one hand, you have these earlier Soviet children's stories, which are often set in orphanages, and here you have a story that's set in this idealized family that every kid wants to be a part of Labzik's family, and every kid wants to be needed, and every kid wants to feel useful, and so you have this deep sense of identification with what the child's needs, and from the child's perspective, that also maps on, as you said, to this incredible political message of solidarity.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We could do a whole panel on Leipzig alone, which would be amazing. But I want to kind of move back to this question that I brought up earlier, because I think it's still so relevant today, which is the theme of assimilation and the concern of assimilation on the part of the people creating these texts and how it ends up being expressed in these texts. And I know, Jen, you have some stuff, and we're sort of coming to the end of the program, so just, you know, I want to make sure we get to everything. And also, Naomi, if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear that. So Jen, if we could start with you.
So in 1939, Itcher Goldberg, who's the pedagogical director, the educational director for the JPFO, he makes this manifesto in the pages of this Yiddish children's magazine, for parents. And he says, the melting pot ideal is the hallmark of the ruling class, and assimilation is a means of control. It's a means of hegemony by the ruling class over the working classes, not just Jews, but everyone. And that if we're going to achieve a true social or socialist democracy in the United States, it needs to be a cultural democracy too. And so that's really the hallmark of Yiddish communist children's literature and pedagogy in the through the 1940s and 1950s, is this sense of what does it mean to create an American cultural democracy, and what is the role of Yiddish? Obviously, the role of Yiddish changes dramatically, and it becomes a way of trying to connect parents and children together through the language, because the children no longer have the language. And so it becomes a way of binding generations together and of creating a intuitive relationship between the values, like a tactical relationship between the values of Jewish culture and the language itself, expressing those things intertwined as opposed to separately, which, as we know, was less successful. But I think a lot of Jewish cultural values have been passed down in a way that that the language has not been passed down. So I think that was a struggle that Itcha and the movement struggled with because of the Cold War, but also just because of all the forces working against, multilingualism in the United States, which we still struggle with today.
To say the least. And I want to come back to the title of your essay, which is that a language is like a garden. And that was a quote from Shlomo Davidman, right?
That was a book or an essay that he wrote for his daughter much later in life, where he talks about, a language has to be nurtured, it has to be watered, it has to be cultivated. It's not a functional thing, it's a living thing, and you need to treat it with love and respect, and you can't ignore it.
Right. And that was tied into to their own understanding of the forces of assimilation or the forces of Americanization.
Exactly.
Naomi, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in because no one has actually said this, that maybe it's just clear to me because I work in traditional Jewish cultures more, but the dog itself is an emblem of assimilation, right? So traditional Jews don't have dogs.
Someone said it.
When there's an article in the Beis Yaakov Journal comparing Jewish children's literature in the Orthodox world and the non-Orthodox world. And one of the things they say is that it's all about dogs in the secular world. And this whole, I just want to throw in one other sort of children's story, which is so astonishing. The whole question of, can a dog be Jewish, right? So is a dog going to understand Shabbos? Can a dog be taught to understand Shabbos? There's a story by Devorah Baron called Liska. It's a Hebrew story about a dog that keeps kosher, and called a dog named Liska. It's interesting that it sounds so similar to Labzik, and I wonder if, I guess it's earlier though. So, and Liska falls in love with a brute, non-Jewish dog, and the little Jewish kids in the shtetl who love Liska end up stoning Liska to death. It's a kind of, the whole question of Jews and dogs is very, very charged in many different directions, and has to do with to what extent the Jews see themselves as human beings or animals, human animals. Anyway, just something I wanted to throw in there.
I think that's really interesting that dogs, if we can think about dogs showing up in this literature as a way of working through the process of Americanization, so that assimilation is not just America taking things away from Jews, but Jews taking American things and making them Jewish or making them Yiddish, right?
Right. Actually, I'll just throw in one more thing about Weinreich and Yivo, which is that Weinreich said, if you want to know whether American Jews still have something of the Eastern European ancestry about them, don't ask them if they know Yiddish. Ask them if they're afraid of dogs.
Now, Naomi knows I love this because I'm not a dog person. I grew up very fearful of dogs for reasons that I'd never really understood, but since I learned that from Naomi, I always thought that it has to do with something genetic, something epigenetic about my Ashkenaziness. All right, so we're coming up with 1:49. Miriam, do you want to say something about assimilation, or do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just say a very quick thing. So there are two really polar approaches that I think we see in that diverse body of text that I've tried to put before us and Honey on the page. On the one hand, we see the Sabbath stories that I open the book with, which are written by leftists who are secularizing, and yet they are taking kids back to this very traditional notion of the Sabbath that their own families are probably not practicing. So that's one approach. And then all the way at the other end, we have Sarah Liebert writing about a Jewish farming family living outside of Boston, Miriam's birthday party, which I understand is actually quite a favorite with some of the book's younger readers so far, because it's about birthdays, and birthday parties are relatable for American children, right?
They're not very Yiddish.
Right. So what is this thing of a birthday party? That's the whole plot. And the plot hinges, and I'll just super quick aside, people are always getting lost in this literature, especially girls. Girls are not where they are supposed to be. And I think this is part and parcel of how modern Yiddish girlhood gets formed. The idea of girls not showing up at where they're supposed to be at a certain time and place. A lot of plots hinge on that. But in Miriam's birthday, Miriam disappears because she needed to go get the little neighbor boy, Johnny, who they had forgotten to invite to her birthday party. And it can't begin, and they can't do the ritual of singing happy birthday until Johnny comes. And so she fetches little Johnny, and then they're able to sing. And then they sing Yiddish songs, which Johnny doesn't know because he doesn't speak Yiddish, and that's explicit in the story, but that's okay. And then he returns to his family. So it's just this very kind of frank treatment of where this family lives and who the children's social circle is, and the way that I think the adult reading it sees that most of the birthday party is the kind of annoying relatives who show up and adjust your bow. But the one that the girl cares about is her friends from the environs, and those are not Jewish.
Interesting. So we have a special guest here who's the most Yiddish dog that I know. This is Coleman. Hi, Coleman. I miss you. I'm going to ask Alex if we have any questions since it's 1:51.
Oh, Thank you for this conversation so far. It's been beautiful. And before we take questions from the audience, I just want to say I put in the chat box the link to purchase this book.
yeah.
It's a gorgeous book. You will not be disappointed. Get yourself a copy. And I'll give you a moment to write some questions in the Q&A box. Rather than the chat, there's a special function for Q&A that lets it be all in one place, which is really helpful. And while you collect your questions there, I'll start off with a question of my own, which is, I wonder, Miriam, if you could tell us about the title. Just for those that aren't familiar with this beautiful image of honey on the page, where does that title come from? And maybe you could explain a little bit about the relationship of this repertoire to the kind of cheder scene that image is from.
So the tradition in the cheder, which as we know is the informal school system in which Jewish boys, often as young as 3 or 4, would participate and would start becoming versed in Aleph base, basic literacy, and holy texts. The custom was that on the first day of school, the parent would drop off the little boy and he would be instructed, honey would be poured on the page of typically a primer, like an Aleph-based primer, and he would be instructed to lick the honey off of the page in order to make learning sweet and to really incorporate that sense of sweetness bodily. And I talk in the introduction about how when I started my my Hebrew education, I had already been going to Sunday school and having some Jewish reading experiences, but when I was in 4th grade and I started learning Hebrew seriously, my teacher didn't want to deal with honey. So she brought around little chocolates and she would pour a little cascade of chocolate onto everybody's book. And she told us, eat these chocolates off your book. And so in the same way that the chocolate is supposed to evoke that honey, I'm hoping that the English translations are evoking the original Yiddish, which is much messier, much bigger, much stickier in some sense. And also, I would say that the stories that I've translated are an artifact of a modernizing Yiddish school system that has left the cheder behind and is moving towards shul or shule models, many of which, at least in the American context, both North American and South American, are after schools that students are attending after a morning in public school.
And on the topic of your book, could you say a word about the illustrations? There's wonderful illustrations in your book.
I would love to. So one of the real triumphs of this book that I feel proud of is that we were able to release it not only with so many of the original black and white illustrations, mostly line drawings and woodcuts, but also to commission these beautiful new illustrations from Paula Cohen, who also did the artwork for the cover. And we couldn't have as much color or as many illustrations as I would have liked, but reality and costs of things do enter in. But Paula worked so hard to make the pictures authentic, to authentically convey what was happening in the scene with all kinds of accurate historical details, to make the pictures efficient in terms of the amount of visual information that they are contributing, and also to use the pictures as another opportunity to increase the visible diversity in the book. So to introduce women in the background. We have a little boy who is walking home from a really bad day in cheder, and he stops to have a chat with biblical Noah. And we see Noah's wife, perhaps Naamah, as she's called by the rabbinical sages, in the background, in the living quarters of the ark. So moves like that Paula made. When Sprinze, the indefatigable Sprinze, climbs up on a lamppost so that she can read her book in peace in the last selection of the anthology, we have a little gaggle of concerned mothers who are gathered at the base of the lamppost, and one of those mothers is a woman of color. So Paula really brought in this rich visual information to try to bridge the world that these stories came from and the world that hopefully they can speak to now.
Beautiful. We've got a question here about absence, and this is something we touched on a little bit, but I wonder if we could go a little bit more into this. The question of what was absent from both the literature at the time that these stories were written that prompted these writers to say, I need to, create these particular Yiddish stories, that they're fulfilling a role that doesn't exist elsewhere, and what's absent today from non-Jewish literature for children, that perhaps having these stories in English really contribute something to Jewish children's literature today.
Anyone else want to speak to absences, or should I jump into that one? Well, so one of the most fun audiences for this book is contemporary Jewish children's authors and illustrators. And we launched the book yesterday with a presentation to the PJ Library Authors Network. And I think that we see the absence that I'm most hoping to redress is a kind of absence on the contemporary American and Western scene shaped like Yiddish, meaning we've moved so far away from knowledge of Yiddish and authentic Yiddish materials. We see a lot of representations of the longing for Yiddish that are being filled imaginatively by kind of making up what the shtetl was like, or what things were like 100 years ago. And that's great, that's fine. There's definitely a place for really exercising our imaginative muscles, but it's also really nice to know that there's a chain, there's a golden acate that we can get back to and follow back to knowledge of what things were like for Yiddish speaking Jews 80 and 100 years ago. So that's part of what I'm hoping to redress.
That's beautiful. There are more questions, but I feel like that's a really perfect place to stop. Thank you all so much. This has really been so fascinating. And like I said, I put the link to buy the book in the chat. I hope you will check it out. It's really special. You'll want to read these stories to your children and to other people in your families.
It's a book it's a book for families and children and adults and aunts and uncles. It's lovely.
Well, Miriam, Mazel Tov. Yeah. Congratulations on this release, and we wish you a lot of success with this.
Thank you all for making this so special and festive and such an intellectual adventure together.
And thank you, Naomi and Jennifer. This was what a dream conversation.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you all again soon.